Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Now, Delhi and Canberra sought to provide a boost to trade and security ties in a meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Australian counterpart Malcolm Turnbull, who was on a 4-day visit to India. The two countries signed 6 agreements, including one for expanding counter-terrorism cooperation, but could not conclude negotiations for comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, which they have been negotiating for a while now. The discussions also veered around energy, in Turnbull saying that Australia is ready to supply uranium to India as soon as possible. The two countries had signed a civil nuclear cooperation 3 years ago, but the actual supply has not yet commenced in the absence of a commercial contract. On this edition of The Big Picture, we'll take a look at the hits and misses of the Australian Prime Minister's visit to India. Joining me on the program today are Commodore retired C. Uday Bhaskar, Director, Society for Policy Studies. He's also a security analyst. Suresh K. Goel, former ambassador. Sanjay Kapoor, editor, Hardnews, and our in-house foreign affairs expert, Akhilesh Suman. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you, of course. What do you believe are the major takeaways from this summit?
I think when we talk about the visit this time, we need to look beyond the agreements which have been signed, and there are clearly hits and misses, like you mentioned, no SICA, no guarantees on supply of the uranium fuel, etc., etc. But I think we need to go beyond that kind of a framework of the agreements in which we look at the visit. To my mind, the single most important fact about the visit is there are two. First of all, a visit in quick succession after Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, and then Australia. And clearly, as you can see, where we are going towards in terms of a regional approach to our own foreign policy interests. Number two, if you look at the joint statements and you look at the first 23 paragraphs, the clear focus is basically Indo-Pacific. Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean Rim cooperation. So there is a clear focus between the two leaders to find synergies or to find collaboration in terms of an approach to Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as Indo-Pacific, as a kind of a combined region where both India and Australia have a stake in the two oceans. So we can elaborate on this further, but I think that was a single most important factor of the visit.
Indeed, fair enough. You know, Commodore, as far as China is concerned, how much did China play on the minds of both the Prime Ministers, Malcolm Turnbull and Narendra Modi? It seems like we've lost the line there with Commodore Uday Bhaskar, but we'll ask him that question in due time, of course. But Sanjay, what do you believe are the major misses as far as this visit is concerned? I mean, there were quite a few, isn't it? Because no agreement as far as trade was concerned.
No agreement on trade, and it has been they've been struggling for quite a while on the SICA, Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement. There they have said that they are committed to actually sign it in the next as soon as possible. That hasn't happened, and it's not very easy to do it, because what has really happened that there is a certain amount of, you can say, dampness which has come into even getting SICA countries to sign SICA, because domestic industry gets deeply impacted, and most of the SICAs that we have signed, especially maybe when it comes to a similar agreement with Singapore, we have realized that Indian industry has been cribbing, that their competitiveness has been hurt very badly. Similarly, companies in India, domestic sector is not very sure how it will impact when we sign with Australia. The other thing that didn't really happen is the supply of nuclear fuel. And although there is a commitment, and as the Prime Minister Turnbull said, there is a bipartisan commitment that both sides, the opposition agrees that they should do it, but it's because of the fact that the commercial aspect had not been taken, the commercial agreements had not been signed, the flow of the fuel has not really taken place. So what has really happened is that the entire energy seems to be directed towards the security aspect, security and defense aspect, and then you would realize that they are all talking about China. And China, has been cribbing time and again that this is some kind of a compact that India, Australia, Japan has put together to serve as a counterpoint to surround them, and we've engaged in what is called the Malabar exercises. And again, during this visit of Prime Minister Turnbull, we have said that we'll have another exercise in 2018. So if you look at the entire agreement that has been signed, there is a lot of, you can say, promise to do many things. There is a discussion, there's suggestion about how they intend to utilize the Pacific and Indian Ocean. But the focus is basically, you have the big gorilla in the room which is weighing very heavily on both the countries, and that is China.
Indeed. So let me take what you're saying to Commodore Uday Bhaskar, because he is a security analyst at the end of the day. Commodore, you know, as far as the visit of Malcolm Turnbull is concerned, how much of, how much did China really play on the minds of Malcolm Turnbull and Prime Minister Narendra Modi?
Well, I think just to pick up what has been said just now, China is definitely a country of considerable relevance and concern to both India and Australia. And if you look at the text of the joint statement that was issued after the meeting between the two Prime Ministers, Mr. Turnbull and Mr. Modi, I think repeated references to two issues. One is in the maritime domain, the reference to the UNCLOS and the commitment that both sides bring to the table as far as uphold international law is concerned. Now, the subtext of that is in many ways related to China. The second is the reference to the Indo-Pacific, because what really connects India and Australia is the maritime domain. And I think the focus now is more and more on the connectivity between the two oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and officially both are now committed to this particular Indo-Pacific as the turn of phrase. So I think the suggestion that these two countries, along with like-minded countries, there's also a reference to democracy, if you look at the detailed fine print of the joint statement. Now, all of these, I think, are attempts by both India and Australia to punctuate the domain in a certain manner. Now, I just want to clarify one part about the naval exercises that was referred to. In this particular joint statement, India and Australia are committed to bilateral exercises, Index, held in 2015. Now there's a commitment to hold it again perhaps in 2018. So this is a bilateral activity, and it has no direct bearing to any of the other multilateral, plurilateral kind of naval exercises that had been suggested in the past, where Australia was part of called as a trilateral, which involved India, United States, Australia, and Japan. Now, yes, China is monitoring all of this, but I would say that India and Australia have good reason to be exchanging notes about what kind of a security and strategic framework they think they can contribute to or shape. And in that, I think both the major powers, the United States and China, even if they are not explicitly referred to, are stakeholders in this extended Indo-Pacific continuum that will be spoken about.
Sure, fair enough. You know, Akhilesh, I want to talk to you about some of the takeaways, and one of the highlights, of course, was the fact that even though India is not part of the NSG, Australia has, agreed to supply uranium to India. Now, that is a big achievement, isn't it?
Yeah, right. What I am going to tell you, the untold story that has not come in the joint statement and neither in the statement of any of the leaders. That untold story is about Belt and Road Initiative of China. This issue was also talked in very detail between the two leaders when they were talking in private or also in delegation level. Most of the talks went in private, one-to-one talks. And you know, the last month in March, Li Keqiang, Chinese premier, was there in Australia and addressed the joint press conference. And China was very interested that Silk and Belt and Road initiatives should be talked about, but none of the leaders could dare to talk about it because Australia did not agree to this proposal. And this thing was talked with Prime Minister Modi also, and both are converging on the issue that high level delegation, sending the high level delegation in that initiative should not be good for the whole Indo-Pacific region that they are trailing. So it is one of the biggest takeaway as far as India is concerned, because India and China, they are, most of the issues are political in nature, because you are going with CPEC, that is going through our territory, Indian territory on the record, and China is not respecting this thing. So if Silk and Road Initiative, India and Australia join, it will give legitimacy. So I think Australia has agreed that Prime Minister of Australia will not go, and some lower level delegation will be sent from Australia. So I think at this point of time, when CPEC is one of the major issues that is coming between India and China, because China is pressurizing India, and more often than not you will see some sarcastic statements coming from either from in the Global Times or from any of the experts of China, that India doesn't want to join CPEC because it is afraid and scared of something, but it is a political, and I think this is one of the major takeaways that India has taken Australian Prime Minister on board.
So does that also, Ambassador, say that India and Australia are extremely concerned with what China is doing as far as the One Road, One Belt project is concerned? Because China has sent out invitations to all the world leaders and are expecting to have a major, event sometime in May on One Road, One Belt. And, Britain has said that it will not participate or will not send a high-level delegation. The United States too is non-committal. India has clearly said that it will not participate because of the CPEC, and Australia now too not sending any good feelers. So is China a threat then for both India and Australia?
Well, let me say first of all that China is a big factor for both India and Australia strategically in the region, in Indo-Pacific, and Indo-Pacific is not just limited to South China Seas, but both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific per se is a huge factor. And in that factor, OBOR is an important part of it really. And so far the indications are that while China is basically, China considers the whole OBOR, it had a kind of a statement or pretension earlier that it's purely an economic objective, it's an economic configuration. But clearly the way China is now going about it, calling a high-level summit, high-level delegations to participate in the month of May, more or less conveying that China is putting a whole lot of premium on its becoming a success, suggests to me that it is not purely an economic, and most of the countries now see this not as purely an economic configuration, but as a strategic move. So therefore, I would see that most of the countries who have a stake in the region, including the USA, Australia, India, and even some of the ASEAN countries, I would say that probably they would be rather very, very careful, very cautious about sending high-level delegations, even the UK, as you said. So OBOR is a very, very important part of the Chinese presence in the region, Chinese calculus in the region. But I don't think at the moment that the countries who have a stake in the area are prepared to really give their blessings to the idea so far.
Indeed, fair enough. Commodore, at a time when the United States under the Trump administration has pulled out of several major trade agreements, the TPP being one of them, is Australia now looking for strategic partners, and India being one of them?
Yes, definitely. I think Australia is now reviewing its bilateral relationship against the context of a very fluid strategic landscape that is emerging. And there are many reasons that contribute to this, because if you follow the internal debate within Australia over the last few years, one of the major factors was a concern that Australia was moving too close towards China, and there were certain political entities and, shall we say, well-known representatives in Australian politics who were keen that Australia should now have a more robust relationship with China, and also perhaps have some kind of a review of the Australia-US relationship. Now, this in many ways, I think, has encouraged a certain movement as far as the bilaterals with other countries are concerned. And that is where I think Australia is looking at India with renewed interest. Because some of Beijing's actions over the last 6 months, particularly the way in which they had rejected the tribunal award as far as the case between Philippines and China was concerned, has caused a lot of concern in the entire region, all the way, I would say, from ASEAN right through to Australia, that when China believes that its own core interest is at stake, it is willing not only to act unilaterally, but also use military muscle or hint at using military muscle. So I think you could see that Australia is now trying to balance its own bilaterals and not become too closely drawn towards China for a variety of reasons. And that is where I think the salience of India. And I looked at the text very carefully, Frank, and I would say there are repeated references to what I would call as the shared values, as also the shared interest between India and Australia in the strategic and security domain. And much of this, I would say, also corresponds with statements that have been made bilaterally between India and Japan on one hand, Australia and Japan on the other. So to that extent, I would say that Australia is reviewing its major bilaterals within the region, of which both India and Japan, I think, are good examples, which in a way would, I think, provide the necessary balance as far as Australia's relations with both China and the United States are concerned. That's the way I would characterize the reason why Australia is now looking at India with the kind of intensity that it is. Right?
Sure. Sanjay Kapoor, are we seeing the emergence of a new axis now, maybe between India, Japan and Australia, stakeholders in the region who are going to be directly affected by what happens here? Now, they are going to try and deal with the situation by themselves.
Wes, we must recognize one thing. If you're talking about an axis between India, Australia and Japan, it is also, I think, basically inspired by the simple fact that no country in this region is very sure of where the US stands. The United States of America, people experience, has been on the retreat to some extent. Nobody is really sure how Donald Trump is going to really look at the world, and would it be any different from what President Obama used to see, whether there's something called the existence of an Asian pivot. So all these things are compelling, you can say, regional countries of the region to reassess their relationship, figure out what is good for them, what is not good for them. So in the early days, it could be possible for United States of America or their think tanks to goad countries from this region to take on China, but they aren't really sure now, for the simple reason that, do you have the ability to take on China? Do you have the heft to take on China? If you kind of align yourself with Australia, Japan, put together, does it serve your interests or not? So these are the questions that are weighing on the minds of most of these Asian countries. You look at Mr. Abe. Mr. Abe has made 2 trips to meet Mr. Trump, and still he's not very sure, because in the early days Mr. Trump made some angry noises towards Abe, and he wanted to be sure, Japan wanted to be sure that they are on the same page. There is no clarity at the moment, and I think similar kind of mindset is visible in India also. So we are trying to see how best we can work together, because there is great merit in the countries of this region to be together, because there is absolutely a good reason to contain China, because China is getting stronger for a variety of reasons. The space that is being vacated by USA is being taken up by the Chinese. Chinese yes. Also are, in close alliance with Russia. So in terms of both an economic and military power, they look very, very formidable. So we have to find ways to ensure that our interest is preserved, but that has to be from our standpoint, not driven by somebody else.
Indeed, that's a very fair point that you're making. Yes, Ambassador.
And very briefly, I think if you were to refer to basically a kind of a commonality of interests emerging in the region between India, Australia and Japan, yes. But I think axis is far too strong a word. And as Sanjay said, that I don't think that any country in the region at the moment will be so bold as to say that, yes, we are prepared to take on China now. They have far too strong an economic presence there. They are becoming militarily and strategically in the region, and they are all hedging their bets. So at the moment, I don't think that anybody is prepared to say anything about an axis or kind of coalition. But commonality, yes.
Fair enough. Yes, Akhilesh.
Yeah, actually, just I want to remind you that in last years, Australia has always offered to join the Malabar exercise, but India never agreed that. So India doesn't want to see that there should be a war-like alliance between India, Australia, and even with Japan or America. Because see, the political fights between India and China is for a long time, and they fought one war, and after that, the China also retracted, and most of the fights are political in nature, about political hegemony in the region and also at the world scale. So China doesn't want India to emerge at the world scale, and India's main thrust is to emerge at the world stage on its own, in its own right. So we are trying to find allies, political allies like even Australia, Japan, America is there, UK, everyone is there. But the main contention is that if China wants to monopolize this South China Sea area, then it will be impediment not only for the countries of the region, but even India, because India's sea route also will be from that side and it will be challenged the whole region. So that is why if you see the map of Australia, it is, if you see towards the east, Australia is just in the far this and whole deep sea is passing through this. So Australia is a big ally as far as the symbolism is concerned, but as far as India's axis is, India doesn't want to make any axis at this point of time.
Fair enough.
We only want political alignments in the whole world, so that we can get our own right at the world bodies.
That's fair. That's fair enough, of course. But let's take the discussion forward now. Commodore, you know, as far as any missed opportunities, were there any missed opportunities during this visit?
Well, I would just remind ourselves, Frank, that when we talk about India-Australia cooperation across the board, we began this exercise soon after the end of the Cold War. I distinctly remember that when we had a first track 2 meeting, it was the early 90s. We are talking about 92, 93, when India and Australia met, and there was a certain political support given to this endeavor, saying that there were a number of areas, and the maritime had been identified at that time for India and Australia to perhaps make some kind of meaningful joint cooperation and participation. But as we know very well, the politics at that time, in the mid-90s, leading to the Indian nuclear test of May 1998, led to a very, I would say, deep kind of estrangement between India and Australia. And it took some time for that particular, shall we say, experience to be put behind us. So when we talk about missed opportunities, I would only say that based on past experience, perhaps it would be prudent for both India and Australia to identify the equivalent of low-hanging fruit within the maritime domain, where both of them have a certain competence to bring to the table, and look at issues that contribute to the equivalent of the common good and are not necessarily seen as being directed against whether it is China or any other entity that would seem to suggest that there is some kind of a military dimension to what is being mooted. And here, again, I make the case, which we have said in the past in other fora, that along with countries which are in the ASEAN as also in the Indian Ocean, India has committed itself to the IORA,
Right.
the Indian Ocean Rim Association. Now, there's been very little traction or substance in that particular initiative. I think there is a case for India and Australia to look at specifics there, which are not directed against any third party. And furthermore, if there is enough capacity both in India and Australia to embark on even other sub-regional issues, the Bay of Bengal is an area that again is, I would say, rich for a certain amount of joint endeavor, where we can bring in countries like Bangladesh. Now,
Right.
if you look at the text between Mr. Modi and Mr. Turnbull, there is reference to the blue economy. Now, the blue economy has to be further disaggregated. There are certain strengths that Australia brings to the table. There are some that India can bring to the table. So can countries like Bangladesh and Thailand, amongst others. So I think we need some innovative identification of low-hanging fruit, as I call them, and see how India and Australia can agree on which are the areas that can be prioritized, both bilaterally as
Fair
also
enough.
with some of the other regional players.
Fair
Right?
enough. Ambassador, is this the start of a great relationship going forward?
I'm going to be very, very brief on that because I'm not in the business of crystal gazing. Yes, I think both the countries are making a good start to develop their friendship, to develop their relations. I recall in the 1980s, there was a great deal of suspicion, great deal of discomfort. At that time.
Let me frame the question in another way.
yes.
Do both the countries have far more to lose if they do not cooperate, or
I think both the countries now realize that the cooperation amongst them is very, very critical for the stability in the region and the peace and security. I think that is one overall phrase which covers everything.
fair enough,
Yes.
fair enough. Sanjay Kapoor, how do the countries take the relationship to the next level?
I mean, relationship between India and Australia is like the cricket series. You know, you have these 5 matches, one-day internationals, and 2020. They create certain kind of excitement, and then it goes away till the next test matches take place. Australia is, you know, geographically, you know, left behind. So it has to somehow has to work towards coming closer to Asia, building up relationship, and has to have become relevant. As Commodore Uday Bhaskar said, there were problems for many years that they have been able to sort out. But it will take a while for it to come to the level that we talk about, so India's relationship with the UK or with the US, because Australia remains a far more small player globally than what is made out to be. Geographically, it is very big, but it doesn't have the clout and the heft that really makes any difference. Yes.
Sure, fair enough. Akhilesh, Suman, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Yeah, actually, what is the crux? That they mentioned that Indo-Pacific democracies. So it is a very particular word that hurts those who are not democratic in this whole region, you mean the China. And this is the natural binding between India and Australia, that both are successful democracies, sustainable democracies, both understand English language, and young population in India are choosing Australia as a destination for studies. So these are the 3 things that binds India and Australia together. Although there was once upon a time there was a skepticism in Australia that we should not be portrayed as an Asian, but now they have understood that no, even though we are not Asian, but we are in the Asia Pacific region. So that hiccup is over now. So I think this is the right time so that we can increase our engagement, not only economic engagement, but our engagement in other fields, strategic engagement, trade engagement, and also people to people engagement is one of the most important, because once doors will be closed from American side or it will be shut halfway, then you will have some leeway in Australia. So our businessmen, our young people can go to Australia and work there.
Sure.
So that is the thing that we can develop.
All right. On that note, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. See Uday Bhaskar, Suresh K. Goel, Sanjay Kapoor, Akhilesh, Suman. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective. For us, that's all the time we have. See you again next time.